All right, let's dive into the world of Severance. Season 2 is coming out January 17th, 2025, so pretty soon.
Yeah, really soon.
And we're going to explore some themes and creative choices, see what might be coming up.
Sounds great.
So, to get started, let's talk about the idea of cognitive mapping.
Okay.
Now, cognitive mapping,
Hmm.
what is that exactly for our listeners who might not be familiar?
So cognitive mapping is, well, think of it like how we understand the world around us. We build mental maps of places, relationships, even like abstract ideas. And in Severance, they take this idea to a whole new level.
Right, because the innies, the characters who only exist at work,
Yeah,
they aren't allowed to make those maps of their workplace.
right, exactly. They're forbidden from understanding the layout of Lumon Industries where they work.
Mm.
But just like us viewers trying to put together all the show's mysteries, they still try to do it anyway.
It's like we're all kind of lost in a maze, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Both the audience and the characters.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that those characters, they're not just mapping the physical space, they're also trying to map their own minds.
Whoa.
Because their memories are actually fragmented because of that severance procedure.
So by mapping their work environment, they're actually trying to piece together their own identities.
Yeah, it's really deep stuff.
Wow, that's heavy. It makes you think, too, about how these days everyone expects you to be a whole worker. Like there's no separation between our work lives and personal lives anymore.
Yeah, you're always on,
Well,
always
yeah.
connected. It gets pretty exhausting.
It really does. And Severance seems to play with that anxiety,
Definitely.
but like on a much larger, kind of scarier scale.
Absolutely. It takes that to the extreme. It shows what happens when that separation or, well, lack of separation is taken as far as it can go.
Speaking of unsettling things, have you ever seen an office designed quite like the one in Severance? It's so weird.
It's definitely unique. It's this strange blend of different styles, almost like time travel. You see these really sleek, modern chairs right next to these clunky old CRT monitors.
Yeah, it's wild. Like they just took bits and pieces from different time periods and kind of threw them together.
Yeah.
But you know what? It actually makes sense when you think about how messed up and disconnected the workers' minds are.
Exactly. There's this writer, Madeline Collier, who wrote a great article about Severance. It was in the New Review of Film and Television Studies. And she describes the office design as this mix of, she says, traditional rigid office spaces and modern flexible layouts. Almost like they're trying to mess with our expectations about what makes a workplace good or bad.
I see. Because whether you're stuck in a tiny cubicle or you're in one of those trendy open offices,
Right.
it can still be used to, well, control workers.
Exactly. And by mixing those styles, the show makes this visual feeling of uneasiness and disorientation, which just adds to that unsettling vibe of the story.
Right. And speaking of control, the creators of Severance, one of the writers, Mohammed El-Masri, said they already have the whole story planned out.
Wow, yeah.
That's kind of exciting, but also a little nerve-wracking, don't you think? To know they've got it all figured out already.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. It shows that they're very intentional, which you don't always see in TV shows.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what they have planned for us.
Yeah.
And you know what? Knowing they already have an ending in mind might actually make waiting for season 2 a little bit easier.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Because we know that they're working towards something specific.
Yeah, that's a good point. Gives us a bit of comfort, knowing that it's not just going to wander aimlessly.
Now, remember how we talked about those characters trying to understand their own minds?
Yeah.
It's almost like their brains are these black boxes, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it.
We see them walk into Lumen and walk out. But what happens in those 8 hours in between?
It's a complete mystery.
Even to them.
Even to them, exactly.
Which is kind of terrifying if you think about it.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, what if you suddenly realized you were missing a chunk of your life?
Yeah, it really taps into a real fear. And I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling of lost time, especially at work. You go through the motions all day and then it's 5 p.m. and you're like, wait, what did I even do today?
Right, totally.
Yeah.
It's like we're all living with a little bit of that Severance experience, even if it's not as extreme as in the show.
It makes you wonder, how much of ourselves are we willing to sacrifice for our jobs?
It really does. And I think that's one of the reasons why Severance is so popular. It reflects our anxieties about the modern workplace and makes us face some uncomfortable truths.
Absolutely. And with season 2 coming soon, it'll be really interesting to see how they keep exploring those themes and pushing the boundaries of what we think we know. about ourselves and the world around us.
Certainly.
Yeah, it's not just our minds that feel like black boxes. In Severance, even the characters' bodies become mysteries.
Hold on, explain that. I think our listeners are going to want to hear more about that.
So, because of the severance procedure, the innies and the outies, they're sharing a body,
Right.
right? But they experience time in these totally separate pieces. And sometimes they come back to their bodies and things are different.
Like, yeah, when Mark Zinni would get to work with those bloodshot eyes, always freaked me out.
Exactly. Or like Petey, when he was trying to warn Mark's outie about Lumon, he talked about those red eyes, remember? Like, it's a clue. It's like their bodies are keeping track of what happened in those missing hours, even though they can't remember.
So it's not just about lost time. It's like losing control over your own body. That's a whole other level of creepy.
Huh.
And, it makes me think about how we talk about work-life balance these days.
What do you mean?
Well, it's like we're all trying to keep our work selves separate from our personal selves. But what happens when those lines get blurry? Or even disappear completely?
You're right. Severance takes those anxieties and just like explodes them. It makes you wonder, what are we really giving up when we give so much of ourselves to our jobs?
And this whole idea of the black box, the mystery around what happens to the innies, it connects to something else Collier talks about. Severance being part of a whole history of mind-bending movies and books.
Oh, totally. It's like the show is tapping into this fascination we have with memory, identity, and reality.
Like, what kind of movies are we talking about here? Give us some examples.
Well, think about movies like Johnny Mnemonic, Memento, The Matrix, Paycheck, Source Code. They all play with those themes. Split identities, memories you can't trust, trying to figure out what's real. And Collier even points out that those movies were inspired by even older cyberpunk books.
So Severance might feel new, but it's actually building on ideas that have been around for a while, like these fears about technology, control, and what it means to be human.
Exactly. And what's so cool about Severance is that it takes those familiar themes and turns them into this really captivating story that makes you think.
Now, going back to the office design for a sec, we were talking about how it mixes different styles, creating that feeling of being lost. But tell me more about how that actually works.
Well, Collier argues that the design is meant to keep the workers off balance. Remember those rigid cubicles we mentioned?
Yeah.
They represent the traditional top-down structure of a workplace.
Right, like everyone knows their place and doesn't step out of line.
Exactly. But then you also have those open, collaborative spaces, which are supposed to encourage creativity and communication.
Like those trendy tech offices you see everywhere now, where it's all about breaking down walls and working together.
Right. But here's the thing. In Severance, both types of spaces are ultimately used for the same thing, to control the workers. It's like the show is saying that no matter how modern or cool a workplace seems, the power dynamics can stay the same.
And that connects to the overtime contingency, right?
Right.
The way the bosses can just wake up the innies in the outside world.
Totally. It completely destroys that illusion of separation that Lumon created. They talk about work-life balance, but when it benefits them, they break those boundaries without a second thought.
It's the ultimate betrayal. It makes you think about the real-world consequences. If something like Severance actually existed, what would protect workers from being taken advantage of?
That's a question the show makes us think about. It's not just a fantasy. It reflects real anxieties we have about the future of work.
Okay, before we get too gloomy, let's remember that the creators have a plan for how the story ends, right?
Yeah, and I think that gives us a reason to be hopeful about season 2. It shows they're not just making things up as they go. There's a bigger purpose to what they're doing.
Exactly. Knowing they have an endpoint might make some of the crazy stuff that happens a little easier to handle, because we can trust that it's all leading somewhere meaningful.
It's like going on a trip with a guide you trust. You might not know exactly where you're going or what you'll see, but you believe in the person leading you.
I like that analogy. And speaking of journeys, I think it's time to talk about the ethics of Severance itself. Could something like this ever actually happen? And what would happen if it did? One thing I keep coming back to is, could a procedure like Severance actually be possible someday?
Yeah, it's a wild thought.
I mean, the technology seems like something out of science fiction, but this urge to separate different parts of our lives, we're already doing that in a lot of ways.
Oh, definitely. We have separate phones for work, separate email accounts.
Right.
We even talk about work-life balance like they're these two totally different worlds.
It's true. And think about how much effort we put into our online personas. crafting these perfect versions of ourselves for social media. It's almost like we're already living with a kind of digital severance.
It's like we're constantly trying to be everything at once, the perfect worker, the perfect friend, the perfect traveler. It's exhausting.
And that's where Severance comes in. It takes that pressure and just pushes it to the extreme. What happens when we try to separate things too much? What parts of ourselves get lost along the way?
Those are some big questions the show asks, and I don't think there are any easy answers. But that's what makes it so fascinating. It makes us confront these truths about ourselves and the world we live in, even if they're uncomfortable.
I think you're spot on. It's not just entertainment. It's a reflection of our own worries about work, about technology, about the future. And those worries stick with you even after the show is over.
Totally agree. And with season 2 almost here, who knows what other crazy twists and turns are waiting for us.
I can't wait to find out. And don't forget, everyone, Season 2 of Severance premieres January 17th, 2025 on Apple TV plus Sigger. Mark your calendars. You won't want to miss it.
And until then, keep thinking about those questions the show raises.
It might set you free, or it might make you question everything.
That's a great way to put it. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Severance. Until next time.